Good morning. Welcome to Aurora First Christian this day. I would tell you that it's hot, but it's not quite there yet. It's going to get hotter. I would tell you that it's sunny outside, but we don't know what the afternoon is going to bring. I would tell you that no matter what, I'm still happy to be here. I got up this morning and I realized something, guys. Well, I've been realizing it for quite a few days now. But when you see your Father moving in your life to make something clearly evident to you, it really says something to you. It really does. We're in the book of John still, and we're in the 18th chapter. And I'm going to read something that I read a little bit of last week. So while you guys are turning there to the 18th chapter, we're going to start in the 12th verse. Now go ahead and I'll open this up in prayer, and we'll really get into it. Father, I thank you that you alone are God. I thank you that the way that you are towards us isn't always clear. Sometimes we look at it in a way that we shouldn't. Help us to see. Open our eyes that we may draw closer. We ask this because we are your children and we trust you. Amen. In John, in the previous chapters, when Jesus is explaining, or when John is explaining the life of Jesus, we find that we've entered into not the book of signs, right? Because the book of John is broken up into two sections, the book of signs and the book of glory. And the signs book goes all the way up until his raising of Lazarus. But everything after that, and matter of fact, a lot before that points to his glory, to who he is, to his character, that which reveals who our trust should be placed in. We find that he has recently prayed for his disciples. He's recently reminded them that these things are about to take place. And even from the mind of John, when he writes this, it's just last week that Jesus knew all that would happen to him. And he came forward and he began to, as it were, be an intercessor on the behalf of his disciples, right? To protect them and to shield them from all that could possibly happen to them, right? Because he loved them. Jesus had just, as it were, handed himself over to the soldiers and to the angry mob, as it were, that came out to arrest him. And this is where that starts. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world, have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. And that's where we're going to stop. It's just a really, really small section. And if I had to put any sort of title to what it is that we were talking about, or if I wanted you to think along a certain lines, which I do, because I want you to see something here, right? The title that I would say is, "When Things Look Like They're Falling Apart, Trust." To understand this in all of its absolute glory, you see that Jesus now is in the hands of a band of soldiers, right? This is that Roman guard, the ones that were well, probably somebody who was given to guard the temple, someone who had been given to guard the palace of the high priest because they had such a thing, right? And to have a palace of the high priest, even in that, it tells you that this whole thing is messed up, right? Nothing is as it should be. We understand when we read throughout all of the history of the Bible, the high priest was simply to be one of the people, although he was to be separate from them, as in where he lived. There were certain towns, as it were, that he was to reside in, right? These were towns just like the towns that the people resided in. His profession was provided for by the people, right? They would bring this food to him and so on and so forth. And the food that he was to eat of was supposed to be of the sacrifices that they were to bring to God for their sins, right? So his role was to be mediator between God and man and God, right? To represent one before the other, right? And so he didn't have time to farm, and he didn't have time to shepherd, and he didn't have time to do all those other things, simply because his mind was to be focused on that role and that role alone. The high priest was to be one of a line of Aaron, right? A descendant of Aaron. And he was to exhibit certain properties. A care for the people was one of them, right? A care and a concern for their state, right? How their standing was before God. He was to present them, as it were, and stand in front of them with their sacrifice. And he was to be there to oversee their hands being placed on the animal. And he was there to then sacrifice the animal on their behalf. It was a very, very significant role that their sins would be transferred, as it were, to this animal. And then the blood of the animal was to take place of theirs. He was there to be someone to reassure, as it were, the people of their relationship with God. Right? To someone who was not to be judgmental over them. He never once looked at them and said, "You're sinful." Right? He was there just to mediate. And that had crumbled. If you remember reading in the book of Malachi, or if you remember reading in the book of Amos, if you've ever read those books before, God was very, very fed up with not only the people, but the priests. Because the priests themselves didn't properly represent God, and they didn't properly represent people. And they began to not have a regard for either side. They disregarded the people. They disregarded God. They misrepresented the people. They misrepresented God. And in everything that they did, they had forsaken their role. And what we see here is just simply an even greater forsaking of that role. To live in a palace as you were above these people, that you were better than them, to be given a royal guard, so that way you were able to, as it were, execute your own judgments. Dude, it's Jewish mafia, or with Roman enforcers. Self-seeking, self-serving. Everything had fallen from what it was that it was called to be. And Jesus is led off to this place to be in front of this Annas. Maybe you need to know who Annas is. So that way, because these people that John wrote this to, they would have had an understanding of who Annas was. Annas wasn't high priest anymore. It shows that the high priesthood even stopped following the rules that God had laid down. Annas was high priest for say, 6 to 9 years. Right? And then he was deposed by Roman officials, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, had taken his place. That doesn't sound like a God-ordained thing. Aaron was ordained as high priest, and he lived out his role till his death. His children took his place. They lived out their role. It wasn't some political run office that those above you in power could take away your role. So Jesus is brought to this, as it were, political leader, someone who would have still had influence with the Romans, someone who was supposed to be an advisor, as it were, a counselor at the very, very least to his son-in-law, but he's more like a co-conspirator. So Jesus is in the hands of a very corrupt people. And it looks, for all intents and purposes, as if things are crumbling. Doesn't it? Before, Jesus had never been somebody who was in custody of any other official. He had been somebody that was always in command of what it was that he was doing. He had always been there to protect those that were around him. And of course, his last action was to do something to protect those that were around him. At least the last one that we looked at. But the world is now turned upside down. Absolutely upside down. Caiaphas held his position for about 16 years. And then he didn't hold it anymore. So they lead him to this Annas and this Caiaphas. And it's really, really important that first they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, in hindsight, John writes that. But there's purpose in it. So Jesus is in the hands of people who had a vision, as it were, that it would be expedient that one man should die for the nation. And you can think what that might look like in the eyes of them. Well, we've got this one, so we're going to put him to death. And that will be what's best for us. Because then we won't lose our political power. We won't lose our political position. We won't lose our influence. Right? Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Now, for context, I want you to think for a moment as if you are Peter. Because without that perspective, you don't see where John is coming from with this. Why is Peter outside? Why did he follow? Think about that for a moment. John, simply, we understand why he followed. He was someone who understood that he was the disciple that Jesus loved. And he knew that. And he was there to be with somebody that he knew loved him. There was a commitment and there was a relationship that was there between him and the priest. And he was known to him. It's not hard to think that he was known to him, because we understand that John has had this background with all of these people, and maybe he studied underneath him for a time period or whatever. The Bible doesn't truly tell us. But he was a disciple of John the Baptist, and then he became a disciple of Jesus Christ. So that shows us that he has been close to this Jewish thing for a very, very long time. And maybe that's why there's this place of comfort that he has between him and the high priest. That this as it were relationship that they know each other. Because if I don't know you, I'm not letting you into my house. Right? So he goes in with Jesus. And Peter is outside because, let's face it, he doesn't know what to do. Would you? So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he says, "I am not." What do you do when you are confused? What do you do when you're hurt? What is it that you do when you're at a loss and your whole world has been turned upside down and you almost don't know what your next steps are? You fall back on what you know, don't you? You fall back on that fear and on that self-preservation and on that self-protection, right? You forget a lot of things because this is what you know, this is what you're comfortable with, and fear puts you someplace, doesn't it? And that's where we find Peter. He's jumped back to a place where that's not me. It's this place of, as it were, um, just trust. And you wonder why I say that, but at the Last Supper, when Jesus was speaking to Peter, he said some things to him, didn't he? He said, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. But don't worry, I have prayed for you, and when you return, strengthen your brethren. So in Jesus' eyes, this is not some place that Peter is not going to make it past. But in Peter's eyes, it's this, I don't trust what it is that he said. Matter of fact, what he said is the farthest thing from my mind. Peter has up until this point entered into a place of comfort, a place of, as it were, complacency. Things always happen just like this. I've been doing this for X amount of time with the same people. And I know that things are supposed to go like this. Matter of fact, I even know where they're supposed to go. Because plain and simply, we are getting a kingdom. We're getting a kingdom. Now all of that has been turned upside down. And in his mind, the world is turning upside down. Because things are not the way that they're supposed to be. Now, the servant and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. And they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Standing amongst those people. Because you do not know what else to do. It's cold. There's something going on over there, and I can see it, but it scares me. But I'm too scared to move. My hope is in that this world is not going to be so far upside down that my reality is going to have to change. Right? But in front of his eyes, his reality is changing. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. And I have said nothing in secret. Are the disciples, some of them that he's being questioned about? Aren't they standing right there? Two of them, Peter and John. Jesus doesn't jump up to defend himself or to even say, hey man, what about them? They're part of this too. Matter of fact, what he says is something that attracts more attention to him and takes the attention away from them, right? Because what he says is something that agitates them. It stirs up an anger in them, as it were, right? You know, it's. I'm not going to answer your questions. Matter of fact, I'm not going to give you grounds to even, have something against me. It really adds to that whole, they hated me for no reason, or they hated me without a cause. There was no just cause for the hatred of Jesus. All he was doing was trying to correct for all of these years that he'd been walking on the earth. All the misunderstandings, as it were, the misconceptions about relations between God and mankind, and what it is that looked like. Correcting those that were wrong, and those that were wrong are the ones whose hands he's in right now. And it's by his own accord that he's there. And in his action towards them, he removes the attention that could have been placed on them and drags it back to himself. Enough that a guard would reach out and strike him. And he simply says, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Again, Paul pointing to their fault. Taking the attention off of those that are around him. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? And he denied it and said, I am not. I'm not trying to put Simon Peter under the bus. He does a good enough job of that all on his own. Right? Denying the very one that's protecting him right now. Denying the very one that's in control of all of these things. And if you really, really look at it, he's watching out for him. He's really got the whole situation right here. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, asked, didn't I see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. When you step back and you look at all of these things, the world is not upside down. Things are happening just the way that they should be. Well, when you look at how things are going, even the timeline, you know what I mean? It's the time that things happened and such, they're all in the hand of God. They're all under his control, and he hasn't missed a beat. But when we look at things differently, well, we might see that. We might. It just really depends on our perspective. What I want to say to you today is simply this. There's a time in our lives, whether you've experienced it yet or not, in our walk with God or our lives, as it were, when we get really, really comfortable in a situation. And then being comfortable in a situation, we become complacent, right? Where we almost are not doing the things that we really need to be doing. Right? We get comfortable, and when you're comfortable, there's no growth. None. Well, when you're comfortable, maybe you might grow out. Um, you know, you might get comfortable in front of the fridge or the stove, but you become comfortable. And Jesus' disciples, all the time that they had been walking with him, had been getting very, very comfortable. They'd been becoming complacent, as it were, to a certain extent, to the point where they didn't even hear what he said at times. Right? Because it's this is not what's important anymore. We're walking with Jesus, and what we think is supposed to happen is what's going to happen. And there's no growth in that. None whatsoever. And Peter, at this point in his life, needed growth. He needed something that would draw him back to where it was that he belonged. All too long he'd been getting just comfortable. Jesus asked him the night before, pray. Not in John's gospel, but we find in the synoptic gospels this prayer, as it were. Pray that you do not enter into temptation. Be in communion with God, so that way you're not going to fall into this place where this temptation would be. This place where you fall out of trust in God for whatever it is that's happening. And in our lives, sometimes God will shake it up. He'll step in, and his purpose in shaking things up is you are not growing. You've gotten way too used to the thing that you're doing. Whether it be in your relationship with God or in your life. And something needs shaken up because something needs change. And there's only two places to go when something like that happens. You will either draw away from God and be at a distance, waiting for something comfortable to happen again. Or you will press in. Or you will press in. Even if you just sit idly by, that's a drawing away when you should be pressing in. These times in our life, they have meaning. And that meaning is for growth. When our Bible says all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose, it truly means it. The Apostle Paul, when he wrote that, he had that understanding that whatever it is that you go through, its desire from the heart of God is to draw you closer. And even if something looks bad to you, even if something looks scary, even if something looks like something devastating happened, its purpose is to bring you closer to God. And Peter needed that. Peter needed that memory of when you return, strengthen your brethren. Because in that time of trial, he understood that God had never left him. And that everything that happened was in God's hand, no matter what it looked like on the outside. When it looks like the enemy is the one who has control of everything. When it looks like defeat. When it looks like separation. It's not. What Jesus would go on to do was be the propitiation, that wrath-absorbing sacrifice, as it were, for the thing that separated us from God. And it wasn't something that happened by chance. And it's not so different in our lives either. What one of us hasn't gone through something and found that if we would have just understood the purpose for it and would have stepped into that purpose, things wouldn't have been better. So it's with that in mind that I wanted to share this with you. Because we're all going through something. Let's see what God has for us. My phone's trying to reconnect. Because in seeing what God has for us, it's one of the most beautiful things that we could ever see. Pressing into God instead of walking away from Him is where we belong. We're here every Sunday at about 10:30ish at Aurora First Christian Church, 1601 Dayton Street, right here in lovely Aurora, Colorado. 810, or is this 11? Either way, come join us. If you can't join us here in person because you're physically unable, then please join us here. If you don't have a fellowship of your own, go find one. May God bless you. May He keep you. May He watch over you and may He guide you. May He turn His face upon you, and may, by His countenance being on you, you may be kept in perfect peace. And don't lose focus. Amen? Amen. God bless you.